Well, hello everyone. I'm really glad you all stopped by for yet another crazy HOA story. My name is Nathan Bingham. I'm 30 years old and a licensed structural engineer by trade. But outside of work, I've always been more at peace around horses, fishing poles, dusty trails, and wide open land than I ever was sitting behind a desk, staring at blueprints. And what I'm about to tell you, well, honestly, if you'd asked me a year earlier how my life was going to turn out, I would have given you the simplest answer imaginable. Quiet, predictable, peaceful. Turns out I would have been dead wrong. My ranch sits roughly 10 miles outside Genoa, Nevada, in a smaller desert community called Silver Creek. Most people out there keep to themselves. Horse properties, sandy roads, sagebrush, cacti, riding trails that stretch for miles across open land. At night, you can hear coyotes way off in the distance while the desert wind moves through the brush like waves rolling across water. And water, out there, water matters, especially when it belongs to you. My property covered just over 2,000 acres of open Nevada ranch land. It wasn't flashy. No giant entrance gates or marble fountains. No artificial waterfalls or perfectly trimmed decorative palms. Just open sky, sand, trails, a lake, and memories. Lots of memories. The lake sat near the center of the property. Calm, quiet, untouched. Some mornings it reflected the mountains so perfectly it looked like the world had flipped upside down. My grandfather used to ride out there with me when I was little. I didn't know it then. But one day, it would all be mine. What really mattered back then was the land. My grandfather found it, bought it, watched it, understood it. Water rights, mineral rights, everything recorded, everything protected. God, I can still remember those mornings. The creaking leather saddles, the smell of dust and horse sweat, the soft sound of hoofbeats moving through sand, the desert air still cool before the Nevada heat rolled in. My grandfather always rode an old sorrel gelding named Jasper. I rode a smaller bay mare named Daisy. Every weekend he'd wake me up before sunrise. "Come on, kiddo," he'd say. "Fish won't catch themselves." And off we'd go. Sometimes we'd ride for nearly an hour before reaching the lake. Other times we'd stop along the trails while he pointed things out to me. Animal tracks, weather shifts, storm clouds moving over the mountains. He had this way of teaching without sounding like he was teaching. "Slow down and look around once in a while, Nathan," he used to say. "Most people miss half their lives because they're too busy rushing through the other half." Back then, I didn't really understand what he meant. I do now. We'd sit by the shoreline for hours fishing while the horses grazed nearby. Some days we talked. Some days we didn't. But honestly, the silence was usually the best part. There's something about Nevada desert silence most people don't understand until they experience it. It isn't empty. It's peaceful. That land became part of me long before I ever inherited it. And that's another thing people need to understand. I wasn't born into wealth. I wasn't raised spoiled. And contrary to what some people later assumed, I wasn't some rich ranch kid handed everything on a silver platter. I was adopted. My grandparents and parents chose me. And somehow that made the love feel even stronger. My father and grandfather taught me patience, structure, responsibility, and how to think before reacting. My mother and grandmother taught me kindness, empathy, fairness. Anyone can criticize somebody, my grandmother used to say, but it takes real strength to understand them first. Funny thing is, I kept hearing her voice in my head throughout this entire mess, especially near the end. After my grandfather passed away, the ranch was left to me. Everything had already been prepared. The deed, the land rights, the water rights, the mineral rights, all legally protected, all meticulously documented. And then there was the letter. I still remember sitting at the old kitchen table opening it. "My dearest grandson, this ranch, this land, it's now your sanctuary, Nathan. Never let anyone tell you otherwise. And never let any delusional, self-entitled person ever take it away from you just because they can see it from their kitchen window. Protect this land at any cost. And never back down from any challenges life places in front of you. Love, Grandpa." At the time, I thought he was just being sentimental. Turns out, he was warning me, because about half a mile down the road from my property sat Silver Canyon Estates HOA. And unfortunately for me, that's where Victoria Sterling lived. Now before I get into her, there's something else you need to understand. I didn't go through all of this alone. Not even close. The people around me weren't just friends. They became the reason I survived the nightmare that eventually unfolded. Kyle Beckett was one of the first. We'd been friends since high school. Same classes, same routines, same dumb teenage decisions. But Kyle always saw things differently than most people. Not louder, not more dramatic, just sharper. After graduation, he went straight into law enforcement and eventually became a fraud investigator. And honestly, the guy was scary good at it. Patterns, paper trails, fake transactions, shell companies, insurance scams, property fraud. Kyle noticed details most people overlooked entirely. Eventually, he worked his way up the ladder to captain, before retiring early and becoming a private investigator specializing in property fraud. At the time, I thought his skills would probably never matter to me personally. Turns out they mattered a whole hell of a lot. Then there was Wyatt Landry. Wyatt was one of those guys who barely talked in high school, but when he did, everybody listened. The day after graduation, he enlisted in the Army. No hesitation, no second thoughts, just gone. Years later, he came back a different person. Quieter, more controlled. Like every movement and every word had purpose behind it. Turns out becoming an Army Ranger tends to do that to people. Wyatt specialized in terrain analysis, surveying, mapping, and land verification. The kind of work where being wrong could get people killed. Before I moved to the ranch, Wyatt walked nearly every acre with me personally. Verified boundaries, checked historical survey markers, mapped water access, confirmed easements. And if Wyatt Landry told you something checked out, you could take it to the bank. What I didn't know at the time was that Wyatt, along with Kyle, would eventually uncover something far bigger than a land dispute. Then there was Mackenzie Doyle. Mackenzie came into my life because of Miguel Reyes. Now Miguel, he was something else entirely. Most people later knew him as the Viper, not because he was loud, not because he threatened people, but because by the time you realized he'd destroyed your argument, he was already 3 steps ahead of you. Miguel and Mackenzie had both been at the top of their law classes when I briefly attended law school years earlier. I eventually shifted toward engineering. Mackenzie stayed. Property law became her specialty. Miguel introduced us during one long study session years ago. And honestly, I knew within 20 minutes of meeting her that there was something different and special about her. She was brilliant, precise, focused, but she also understood people, not just rules. Somewhere along the way, she stopped becoming someone I knew and became the woman I couldn't imagine my life without. Eventually, she also completely fell in love with my dog. But I'm getting ahead of myself. At that point in my life, things were still peaceful. Construction renovations had just started on my new house near the lake. Nothing extravagant, just a home designed to actually fit the land around it. Big patio, outdoor grill station, large windows facing the lake, guest rooms for friends, a horse barn, pastures, and access trails. Simple, comfortable, home. And Grandpa and Grandma's pictures over the fireplace. The first real problem started on a hot Nevada morning while my contractor and I stood behind his truck reviewing blueprints. The tailgate was down, blueprints spread out, tape measures holding the corners from blowing away in the wind. A thin layer of dust already settling across the pages. "You still wanting the 2 guest bedrooms over here?" my contractor asked. "Yeah," I nodded. "Bathroom in between them, and I want the patio extended another 12 feet toward the lake." "Nice setup," he grinned. "You're doing this place right." For a moment, everything felt normal, peaceful. Then we heard tires crunching across gravel. A black BMW X5 SUV rolled slowly onto the property, and the second it stopped, I knew trouble had just arrived. Victoria Sterling stepped out wearing oversized sunglasses, a beige pantsuit, and the kind of expression that practically screamed self-importance. Two HOA board members followed awkwardly behind her carrying clipboards. Victoria slowly removed her sunglasses while looking over my land, not admiring it, evaluating it, especially the lake. "Good morning," she chirped with a polished smile. "I'm Victoria Sterling, president of Silver Canyon Estates HOA. I hope I'm not interrupting." "Yep," I replied immediately. "You most certainly are." My contractor coughed into his hand, trying not to laugh. Victoria's smile tightened. "Then I'll keep this brief. So, you need to know that any construction being done on this property requires HOA board approval." I frowned at her, annoyance clearly showing in my eyes. "Sorry, but I really don't need your approval. This property isn't part of your HOA, never has been, and never will be." "Well, what you don't seem to realize is that the board and I took a vote 2 months ago to integrate this property into the HOA. Passed unanimously. But yes, I will want to verify your claim," she said, a tight grin spreading across her face. "I already have," I replied confidently. "There's no annexation or expansion recorded anywhere in either the registry or zoning offices regarding my parcel." I let a sly grin slip across my face, but only for a few seconds. There was a brief pause as Victoria, aka Karen as I now like to call her, continued flipping through the pages on her clipboard, treating it like it held all of the HOA's holy doctrines. "You don't seem to appear on any ownership records for this parcel," she added. "And given the size of this property for someone my age?" I asked, cutting her off mid-sentence. She smiled slightly. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," I replied, as I leaned against the truck crossing my arms. She then reached into her handbag for a folder. "You might want to look over these welcome package materials." I put up my hand, shaking my head slightly, blocking her as she tried to hand them to me. "Nope. Sorry, but I don't need or want any of your junk mail. Thanks, but no thanks. Besides, it'll just wind up at the bottom of my cat's litter box anyway," I said, crossing my arms again and smirking just a bit. "Besides, this property sits way outside your jurisdiction by at least a good mile or so." That was the moment something shifted. Her eyes moved past me, out across the land, toward the lake, and lingered a bit too long for my taste. That's when I knew this had nothing to do with permits. And that was also the exact moment my peaceful life officially started going straight to hell. The first few weeks after Victoria Sterling showed up on my property were honestly more irritating than threatening. At least, that's how I kept trying to convince myself to look at it in the beginning. Looking back now, that was probably my first big mistake. Because people like Victoria don't just let things go, especially when money and control are involved. And Victoria Sterling? Well, she seemed to take the word no as a personal insult. 3 days after her little visit to my property, the first letter arrived. I still remember standing beside the mailbox staring down at the envelope while warm Nevada wind pushed sand across the road around my boots. Bandit, who at the time was still just an oversized puppy with giant paws he hadn't fully grown into yet, bounded through the sagebrush nearby chasing a grasshopper like it was the single greatest threat Silver Creek had ever faced. The envelope had the Silver Canyon Estates HOA logo stamped neatly across the front in dark gold lettering. Fancy. Pretentious. Exactly what I expected from Victoria Sterling. I opened it right there beside the road. Violation notice. A $1,250 fine. Reason: unauthorized structural modifications and landscaping alterations not approved by Silver Canyon Estates HOA. I actually laughed out loud. Bandit immediately looked up at me with his head tilted sideways as if trying to figure out why paper suddenly seemed so amusing. "Well, buddy," I muttered, scratching behind his ears. "Looks like we're dangerous criminals now." The notice went straight into the trash. A week later, another envelope showed up. Then another, each one more aggressive than the last. Then finally a certified cease and desist letter from some overpriced legal firm Victoria had apparently hired to intimidate people who didn't know any better. Unfortunately for her, I knew exactly how jurisdiction laws worked. Or at least I thought I did. At first the whole thing almost felt ridiculous. Annoying, sure, but still ridiculous. My property wasn't part of the HOA. Never had been. Never would be. Legally, the letters meant absolutely nothing. But then the inspectors started showing up. County Permit Office, Environmental Compliance, Zoning Department, Safety Inspections. Every few days another truck rolled down the sandy road toward the ranch, usually with somebody climbing out already looking exhausted before they'd even introduced themselves. One older county inspector stepped out of his vehicle one afternoon, rubbing his forehead like he'd regretted accepting the assignment before he'd even arrived. "Mr. Bingham?" "Yep, that's me." He looked down at the clipboard in his hand and sighed heavily. "Please tell me you're not constructing an underground casino out here." I blinked at him. "A what?" He turned the clipboard slightly toward me. "That's what today's anonymous complaint says." I stared at him for about 3 seconds before laughing so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. Even the inspector started chuckling. "No underground casino?" he asked. "Not unless the horses are hiding slot machines somewhere." "Well," he sighed dramatically, "that's honestly disappointing. This county could use the tax revenue." Most of the inspectors figured out pretty quickly what was happening. A wealthy HOA president with too much time, too much ego, and apparently an unhealthy obsession with controlling property she didn't legally own or have any jurisdiction over. The strange part was the more every complaint failed, the angrier Victoria seemed to become. "Oh well, seems like that's her problem, not mine." Or so I thought. That's when things slowly started changing. Little things at first. Small enough that individually they didn't seem important. Construction tools mysteriously disappearing overnight. Fence gates standing open when I knew I'd latched them. Fresh tire tracks near riding trails that should have been empty. Vehicles slowing near the property before continuing on. Nothing major. Nothing provable. Just enough to create tension. One evening Kyle stopped by while I was walking near the lake with Bandit. The sun was dropping behind the mountains, throwing long streaks of orange and gold across the water while desert breezes moved softly through the brush around us. Bandit sprinted ahead through the sand, kicking up little clouds of dust before suddenly launching himself straight into the shallow edge of the lake without warning. "Don't you dare!" Too late. The dog exploded back out of the water completely soaked before violently shaking himself dry all over both of us. Kyle closed his eyes as water sprayed across his shirt. "That dog's gonna be the death of me." "You say that now," I laughed. "But you're the one who keeps sneaking him beef jerky all the time." Bandit proudly trotted between us like he'd accomplished something important. For a while, we just walked quietly along the shoreline. That was one thing about Kyle. Silence around him never felt awkward. It just felt normal, peaceful even. Eventually he stopped walking and looked back toward the road, leading out toward Silver Canyon Estates. "She's not gonna stop, Nathan." I glanced over at him. "Who? Victoria?" Kyle gave me a look. "Pretty sure we're past pretending this is about landscaping violations." I sighed and tossed a small stick toward the shoreline for Bandit. "He's already stolen 3 county inspectors from me," I muttered. "One of them spent 20 minutes throwing tennis balls instead of checking permits." Kyle didn't smile. "She's escalating way too fast." That got my attention. I looked over at him more carefully now. "What do you mean?" "She's pressure testing." "From an HOA?" "From somebody trying to see how far they can push before you push back." Bandit suddenly stopped near the waterline, ears standing straight up. A low growl rumbled from his chest. I followed his line of sight toward the road. A black BMW X5 SUV sat parked way off in the distance near the edge of the property. Watching. The second the person inside realized we'd noticed them, the SUV slowly pulled away. Kyle kept staring after it long after it disappeared. Then he quietly said, "You need security." I laughed softly. "Kyle, I'm serious." There was something in his voice now that made the hairs rise slightly on the back of my neck. This stopped being HOA nonsense the second random vehicles started sitting outside your property watching movement patterns. I hated admitting it, but he wasn't wrong. The ranch definitely didn't feel as peaceful anymore. That's when things got real. That's when I decided to make the call. First to my girlfriend Mackenzie and then to Miguel. because this wasn't confusion anymore. This was deliberate. Then things got a whole lot worse. My mail suddenly stopped being delivered. My water was shut right off. Then without any notice, my electricity went off. No warning, nothing, just darkness. This was way too consistent, too clean. And that's when I finally understood. This wasn't about rules. This wasn't about authority. This was all about what sat in the middle of my land, and she wanted it. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Some nights I'd catch headlights slowing near the property entrance before continuing on. A few construction workers mentioned feeling watched while working late. One guy found deep scratches running all along the side of his truck after leaving for lunch. Still, part of me kept hoping it would all burn itself out eventually. That Victoria would realize I wasn't leaving and move on to terrorizing somebody else. I underestimated her badly when my contractor's assistant showed me a note he found under his car's windshield wiper. It was all in capital block letters. You can either stop working on this property immediately, or you'll be reported to immigration. I'd choose wisely if I were you. A few days later, Wyatt introduced me to Stephen Finley. Stephen owned Paladin Security. Former military, calm, professional. One of those guys who somehow managed to make standing still look very intimidating. Bandit instantly fell in love with him. Traitor, I muttered while the dog rolled onto his back demanding belly rubs. Stephen smirked slightly while scratching behind Bandit's ears. He's got good instincts. That's debatable. I smirked. Stephen spent the better part of the day walking the property. Suddenly his entire demeanor shifted. You've got blind approaches near the north side fencing, he said while studying the riding trails near the brush line. Somebody could sit out there all night surveilling this place and you'd never know. That was the moment the situation stopped feeling theoretical. Because Stephen wasn't treating this like an HOA dispute. He was treating it like targeted harassment. Within a week, Paladin Security had installed cameras, motion sensors, patrol routes, monitored access points, and remote alert systems across the property. And somehow, that seemed to make Victoria even angrier. About 2 weeks later, I found deep tire ruts carved straight through one of the horse trails near the lake. The same trail my grandfather and I used to ride together. Fresh beer cans littered the sand nearby. Bandit barked furiously while pacing beside the damaged trail. Somebody had done it intentionally. That night, my phone rang around 9:30. Unknown number. I answered anyway. Mr. Bingham, Victoria's voice said coldly. How'd you get this number? That's not important. No, I replied calmly, staring out toward the dark lake through the kitchen window. It actually is. She ignored me completely. You're making a very serious mistake dragging this situation out by not cooperating with us. I leaned back against the counter. Still trying to bully me off my own property, huh? You don't understand how this works. No, I said quietly. You don't understand where your authority ends. There was silence for about 3 seconds. Then finally, a gravelly, low tone came over the phone. That land could be worth millions with proper development. And there it was. The truth. Finally. Not landscaping. Not permits. Not HOA standards or aesthetic harmony. It was nothing more than a greed for money. And lots of it. I smiled slightly to myself. Well, I said softly, thank you. Her voice sharpened immediately. For what? For finally owning it and being honest for once. Then I hung up, and standing there in the silence afterward, staring out toward the dark water beyond the property, I realized the real fight hadn't even started yet. The next morning started peacefully enough. That was the strange thing about life out at the ranch. Even with tension building around me, the property still had these moments where everything felt normal again. Almost like the land itself kept trying to remind me what peace used to feel like before Victoria Sterling came storming into my life wearing designer sunglasses and an attitude problem. The Nevada sunrise spilled soft orange light across the lake, while Bandit chased dragonflies near the shoreline like he'd just consumed 6 pounds of sugar. Somewhere farther out beyond the fencing, I could hear horses moving through the trails, their hoofbeats dull against the sandy terrain. For a few minutes, everything actually felt okay again. Then my phone rang. Kyle Beckett. And judging by the tone in his voice the second I answered, whatever peace I'd been enjoying was officially over. You home? He asked. Yeah. Why? Need to come by. That immediately caught my attention. Kyle wasn't the type to sound rattled unless something genuinely bothered him. What happened? I asked. There was a brief pause on the other end. You were right about Victoria. That doesn't exactly narrow things down, I said with uncertainty. Another pause. She's dirty, Nathan. Now that got my attention. About 40 minutes later, Kyle's truck rolled onto the property, while Bandit sprinted toward it barking excitedly, like he was greeting a long-lost war hero instead of a guy carrying paperwork. Kyle climbed out holding a thick manila folder. The expression on his face told me this wasn't good. Not good at all. We sat outside beneath the covered patio overlooking the lake while Bandit sprawled nearby chewing aggressively on a stick that was apparently responsible for ruining his entire life. Kyle opened the folder slowly. At first I thought this was just HOA overreach, he admitted. Power-tripping board president. Fake complaints. Intimidation tactics. And now, I asked, not really wanting the answer. Now I think she's involved in something a whole lot bigger. He slid several printed documents across the table toward me. Bank records, vendor invoices, transfer statements. At first none of it made much sense. Then certain names started repeating. Silver Canyon Community Landscaping LLC, Desert Horizon Pool Development, Nevada Desert Enhancement Services. Kyle tapped one invoice with his finger. Know what all these companies have in common? I shook my head. They barely exist. I frowned. What do you mean barely? I mean some of them are registered to empty office buildings. One's tied to a UPS mailbox in Henderson. Another one lists a vacant lot as its corporate address. I leaned back slowly. And Silver Canyon Estates is paying these companies? Kyle gave me a dark look. To the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Things got very quiet between us for a second. The only sound was Bandit gnawing noisily on his stick while a soft desert breeze moved softly through the brush around the patio. How much? I finally asked. Kyle flipped another page. Right now? Rough estimate says around $725,000. I stared at him. You're freaking kidding me, right? Wish I was, Kyle replied. He slid another document toward me. This one's my favorite. I looked down. Silver Canyon Estates Pool Expansion Project. Budget allocated, $410,000. I looked back up at him slowly. You, correct me if I'm wrong, but there is no pool. Exactly, Kyle replied, rubbing his forehead. That was the moment something shifted in my stomach. Because suddenly this didn't feel like harassment anymore. It felt organized, calculated, dangerous. Kyle leaned back in his chair. The landscaping contracts are fake too. Inflated invoices, repeated billing, payments bouncing through shell accounts. And nobody noticed? I asked. Oh, people noticed all right, Kyle muttered. But Victoria controls the board through intimidation and threats. Half those people are terrified of her. Bandit suddenly trotted over and shoved his wet tennis ball directly into Kyle's lap. Kyle stared at the slobber-covered ball in complete disgust. You know, he sighed. I used to work homicide fraud investigations. Somehow this is still less stressful. I laughed despite myself. That was another thing about Bandit. The dog had this weird ability to break tension exactly when people needed it most. Kyle tossed the ball toward the yard while Bandit tore after it like a missile. Then Kyle's expression turned serious again. There's more. Of course, there's always more. There's a company involved called Desert Pines Land Investment LLC. The second he said the name, something about it immediately felt wrong. Corporate. Polished. Way too clean. What kind of company? I asked, rubbing Bandit's ear. Land Investment SPV, Kyle replied. I frowned. Special purpose vehicle? Kyle nodded. They specialize in acquisition and development setups. Quietly buying land through layered holding structures. And they're connected to Victoria? I growled. They're connected to Silver Canyon Estates. He handed me another set of documents. Email chains. financial transfers, meeting log minutes, and suddenly one thing became painfully obvious. Desert Pines wasn't interested in random land. They wanted my land, more specifically, the lake, the water rights, the mineral rights. I slowly leaned back in my chair, staring out toward the calming water beyond the patio. Everything suddenly started making sense. The pressure, the intimidation, the obsession. Victoria didn't care about landscaping violations. She wanted me gone. Period. Bandit came sprinting back toward us with the tennis ball again, skidding sideways across the sand before crashing directly into my chair hard enough to nearly launch himself underneath it. I absently scratched behind his ears while my mind raced. How deep does this go? Cal exhaled slowly. Deep enough that I think you need to stop treating this like neighborhood drama. Before I could answer, another truck rolled onto the property. Wyatt. The second he stepped out of the vehicle, I knew something else was wrong. Not panic, not fear, but Wyatt had that same look he always got when he was still mentally piecing together something he didn't fully like yet. Bandit immediately abandoned us and sprinted toward Wyatt like an excited maniac. Traitor, I muttered again. Wyatt barely reacted while Bandit bounced around his legs. Instead, he looked directly at Kyle. You tell him yet? Kyle shook his head slowly. Was waiting for you. That immediately put me on edge. Waiting for them to tell me what? Wyatt walked over toward the patio, handing a thin folder to Kyle. For a long moment, they didn't say anything. Then Kyle quietly asked, Nathan, did your grandparents, or even your parents, ever talk much about your adoption? I frowned. Not really. Why? Wyatt and Kyle exchanged a brief glance, and suddenly the entire atmosphere around the patio changed. Even Bandit seemed to sense it. The dog stopped bouncing around and quietly settled near my chair. Kyle then slowly sat down across from me. He carefully placed another folder on the table. We found something while tracing older county records. A knot instantly tightened in my stomach. I slowly looked between both of them. Okay, I said carefully. Somebody want to tell me what the hell's going on? For a moment, neither one answered. We found something while tracing older county records. I frowned slightly. What kind of records? Adoption records, Wyatt replied. That caught me completely off guard. I blinked at him. My adoption records? Kyle nodded once. The atmosphere around the patio suddenly felt heavier somehow. Wyatt leaned back quietly in his chair while Kyle slowly opened the folder. At first, I wasn't even looking for this, Wyatt admitted. I was tracing older parcel filings and probate records connected to the ranch boundaries. I then informed Kyle of my findings. He slid several photocopied documents toward me. Old hospital forms, birth records, county archive copies. I frowned while flipping through them. Then I froze. One name immediately caught my attention. Victoria Sinclair. Not Sterling. Sinclair. I slowly looked back up at Kyle. What am I looking at? Kyle rested his forearms against the edge of the table. That was hers and your original surname, he replied. I stared at them blankly. Okay. Kyle quietly slid another page toward me. Same birth date. Same hospital. Same delivery records. Twins. My eyes moved slowly across the paperwork again. Then back again. Then a third time. The air suddenly felt thin. No, I muttered softly. Neither Wyatt nor Kyle spoke. I looked back down again. Fraternal twins. One male, one female. Separate adoptions finalized months apart. My stomach dropped straight through the floor. No, no way. Wyatt's voice stayed calm. Nathan, Victoria Sterling is your biological twin sister. Everything around me seemed to go completely silent. Even the wind. For several seconds, I honestly couldn't process what I was hearing because my brain kept rejecting it automatically. Victoria? That Victoria? The woman trying to destroy my life? My sister? I actually laughed once under my breath, but there wasn't a trace of humor in it. You're fucking kidding me now, right? I wish we were, Kyle said quietly. Eventually, I leaned back into my chair, staring out toward the lake while my mind tried desperately to reorganize itself around what I just heard. Bandit eventually wandered over and rested his head quietly against my leg like he somehow sensed something was wrong. I absently scratched behind his ears without even realizing I was doing it. She doesn't know? I finally asked. Wyatt shook his head slowly. Honestly, we're not sure. That somehow made it worse. I looked back down at the paperwork again. Same birthday, same hospital, same biological parents. The entire time Victoria had been trying to force me off my own land. She'd been targeting her own brother. My grandfather's voice suddenly echoed through my head again. Protect this land at any cost. I swallowed hard. Did Grandpa know? Kyle nodded slowly. We think so. That one hit harder than I expected. Because suddenly dozens of old childhood memories started replaying differently in my head. Questions nobody answered when I was younger. Conversations adults stopped having when I walked into rooms. The strange look my grandfather sometimes got whenever we rode near the edge of the property facing toward Silver Canyon Estates long before the HOA had even been built there. Oh my God! For a long moment nobody spoke. Finally Kyle leaned forward slightly. Nathan. There's more. I laughed tiredly under my breath. There's always more. Kyle opened another folder filled with financial records. This whole thing with Victoria? He said quietly. It's worse than we thought. He slid several documents across the table toward me. Bank transfers, vendor invoices, corporate filings. One company name appeared repeatedly throughout the records. Desert Pines Land Investment LLC. Kyle tapped the page. That company's been circling your property for over 2 years, like vultures circling a dying animal. I frowned. Why? Kyle stared directly at me. The lake. That immediately made my stomach tighten again. The water rights alone are worth a fortune out here, he continued. Add mineral rights and future development access? Nathan. Your property's sitting on a goddamned gold mine. Wyatt quietly folded his arms. And Victoria knows it. Kyle slid another document toward me. Silver Canyon Community Landscaping LLC. Then another. Desert Horizon Pool Development. Then another. Nevada Desert Enhancement Services. I frowned harder. What are these? I asked, voice cracking. Fake vendors, Kyle said flatly. I looked up at him. Say what? Shell companies. Inflated invoices. Phantom projects. He handed me another file. Silver Canyon Estates Pool Expansion Fund. Allocated budget $410,000. I stared at the page. You. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there is no pool. Exactly, Kyle replied. That was the moment everything truly changed for me. Because suddenly this wasn't HOA harassment anymore. This was organized financial corruption. Kyle exhaled heavily. We estimate roughly $725,000 has been siphoned through fake vendors and shell accounts. I stared at him. You're not serious, are you? Oh, I'm dead serious. And Victoria's behind all of it? I asked. Kyle nodded. She's also been funneling money into her adopted brother's company, Wyatt commented. Nick Sterling. Yep, Kyle replied. He flipped to another page. His moving company's already under investigation for insurance fraud. That quieted the patio again. The only sound was Bandit chewing lazily on a stick beneath the table while the Nevada wind moved softly through the brush around us. I stared down at the paperwork scattered across the table. My sister. Fake vendors. Fraud. Shell companies. Land investment groups. Desert Pines. None of this felt real anymore. And somehow the worst part wasn't even the corruption. It was the realization that Victoria wasn't just obsessed with controlling my property. She was desperate, because if she failed to get my land, her entire life, her entire plan collapsed with it. The next few days felt strangely unreal after Wyatt and Kyle's revelation. Every time I looked toward Silver Canyon Estates, my brain kept trying to reconcile two completely different versions of Victoria Sterling at the same time. The first was the woman I already knew. Cold, manipulative, controlling, obsessed with money and reputation. The second, my sister. Even now, saying it still feels strange. Fraternal twin. Same blood. Same birthday. completely different lives. And honestly, the more I thought about it, the more it made me realize how much environment shapes who people become. Because biologically, we started in exactly the same place. But somewhere along the line, our lives split into opposite directions entirely. I grew up with horses, fishing trips, patience, structure, and family dinners around an old ranch kitchen table. Victoria, on the other hand, grew up chasing control, status, money, and appearances. Nature may start the story, but nurture sure as hell writes most of it. The worst part was, I couldn't even fully hate her anymore after learning the truth. Anger? Oh, absolutely. But underneath that anger sat something else now. Sadness. Because somewhere along the way my sister became somebody who viewed human beings as obstacles or servants instead of people. And that realization stayed with me constantly, especially after the vandalism started escalating. 3 nights after Wyatt and Kyle told me the truth, one of Paladin Security's motion alerts went off around 2:30 in the morning. The sharp tone from my phone instantly pulled me awake. Bandit was already up before I even sat upright in bed. The dog stood near the bedroom window, growling low in his throat while staring toward the front section of the property. I grabbed my phone. North perimeter camera. 2 figures were moving near the construction equipment. My pulse immediately spiked. By the time I pulled on jeans and boots, Bandit was practically vibrating beside the door. "Easy," I muttered while grabbing my flashlight. The second we stepped outside into the cool desert air, I saw headlights moving near the far end of the property. Then voices. Male. Low. One of them laughed. Bandit exploded into barking immediately. The flashlight beam caught movement near the construction trailers just as 2 men sprinted toward a dark pickup truck parked near the fencing. "Hey!" I shouted after the fleeing intruders. The truck tore away, throwing sand and gravel everywhere as it fishtailed back toward the road leading toward Silver Canyon Estates. Bandit lunged forward, barking furiously. I barely managed to keep hold of his collar. Several minutes later, another vehicle pulled onto the property. It was Paladin Security. Stephen Finley climbed out alongside Josh Noland, one of his guards. Stephen's expression darkened immediately while examining the construction area. Toolboxes overturned. Fresh graffiti spray-painted across one side of the unfinished garage framing. "Leave." One single word. That was it. But the message couldn't have been clearer. Stephen slowly looked back toward me. "This is escalation." I rubbed a hand across my face tiredly. "No kidding," I replied tiredly. Josh crouched near fresh tire tracks leading back toward the road. "These guys weren't random idiots," he said quietly. "They knew exactly where your blind spots used to be before we installed surveillance." Stephen's jaw tightened slightly. That means somebody familiar with the property layout talked. Nobody could accuse me of handing her favoritism when she had stepped into second chair without hesitation. As co-counsel handling property law, land use disputes, and HOA jurisdictional challenges, she was exactly where she needed to be. And considering Victoria's people were already searching for anything they could twist into a conflict of interest, the last thing we needed was more ammunition. Honestly, Mackenzie preferred it that way. That was another thing about her. Somehow she could walk directly into absolute chaos and still make things feel lighter for a few minutes. Unfortunately, those lighter moments never lasted long anymore. About an hour later, we were seated around the patio table reviewing documents while Bandit slept beneath Mackenzie's chair with one paw draped across her boot like he was guarding her personally. Miguel eventually excused himself to take a call with the broader legal oversight team, leaving the rest of us buried beneath paperwork. Kyle spread several financial records across the table while Mackenzie reviewed them carefully. The deeper she read, the darker her expression became. "These transfers are unbelievably sloppy," she muttered. Kyle nodded. "That's what happens when greedy people think nobody's watching." Mackenzie flipped another page. "Good Lord." "What?" I asked. She looked up at me. "Nathan, they weren't even trying to hide some of this." She turned one document toward me. Silver Canyon Estates Community Improvement Assessment Fund. Multiple 6-figure withdrawals. No corresponding construction records. No approved vendor confirmations. Absolutely jack squat nothing. Mackenzie slowly leaned back in her chair, softly, shaking her head with disbelief. If this gets subpoenaed in court, Victoria's dead in the water. Kyle folded his arms. That's assuming we even get that far before she panics. The second he said that, an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach, because deep down, I think all of us were starting to realize the same thing. Victoria Sterling wasn't losing control gracefully. She was spiraling, and desperate people do dangerous things. The following week was when things truly started unraveling. Up until then, Victoria's harassment still operated mostly in the shadows. Intimidation, pressure, vandalism, legal threats. The kind of behavior people like her convince themselves they can still control. But once desperation starts mixing with fear, people stop thinking clearly. And Victoria Sterling was getting scared. You could feel it, even from half a mile away. The first sign came when Silver Canyon Estates suddenly held an emergency HOA board meeting late on a Thursday night. Kyle only found out because one of his contacts inside the county clerk's office noticed several rushed filings tied to emergency financial authorizations. That alone immediately raised red flags. Then the HOA treasurer, Sheila Nichols, called me the next morning. Honestly, I almost didn't answer. I was out near the trails with Bandit checking fencing repairs when my phone started vibrating in my pocket. The second I saw her name on the screen, I stopped walking. Bandit immediately sat beside me, staring up curiously. "Sheila?" I answered cautiously. Her voice sounded shaky. "Nathan, we need to talk." That immediately tightened every muscle in my body. "What happened?" I asked. "I can't talk over the phone." I looked out across the trails toward the distant hills. "Sheila, if this is some kind of bullshit setup." "It's not," she interrupted quickly. "Please, just listen to me." There was genuine fear in her voice now. Not nervousness, but real fear. "We need to meet somewhere private." About an hour later, I met her at a small roadside diner several miles outside Genoa. The moment I saw her sitting in the far booth near the window, I knew something was seriously wrong. She looked exhausted, dark circles beneath her eyes, hands trembling slightly around her coffee cup. Every few seconds she glanced nervously toward the parking lot like she expected somebody to come storming through the doors behind me. I slid into the booth across from her. "Sheila, she knows somebody's digging," she whispered immediately. I frowned. "Who?" I asked. "Victoria, who else?" My stomach tightened. "She doesn't know everything yet," Sheila continued quickly, "but she knows financial records are being looked at. She's panicking." And there was that word again. Panicking. The waitress stopped briefly to refill coffee cups before walking away again. Only after she disappeared did Sheila lean down beside the booth and pull out a black external hard drive from her purse. Then she slid it carefully across the table toward me. My pulse instantly spiked. "What's this?" I asked, a bit intrigued. Everything I could copy before she started locking people out of the records. I stared down at the drive. Emails, financial transfers, board communications, vendor contracts, potentially everything, all tied up in a neat little bow. Sheila swallowed hard. "Nathan, I didn't realize how bad it was at first." "You signed the financial reports," I replied. "I know." There was real shame in her voice now. Victoria always had explanations. Delayed paperwork, temporary transfers, development investments. She made everything sound legitimate. "And now?" I asked. Angry tears welled slightly in Sheila's eyes. "Well, it smells worse than horse shit under a heat lamp on full power. I think she's completely lost control." That silence between us suddenly felt very heavy. I finally picked up the hard drive slowly. "Okay, so what's on this drive exactly?" Sheila looked toward the window again before lowering her voice further. "Emails between Victoria and Desert Pines." That immediately got my attention. "There are also communications with Nick, her brother." She nodded shakily. "And several men she hired." A cold feeling settled into my stomach. "Hired for what exactly?" Sheila hesitated, then quietly said, "To make your life a living hell until you fled the property." For several seconds, I just stared at her. Not because I was shocked anymore. Honestly, by that point, part of me expected it. But hearing it confirmed out loud still hit differently. She authorized harassment and vandalism? Sheila slowly nodded. Vehicle surveillance, too. Jesus Christ. I muttered. My jaw clenched. Sheila. Why tell me this now? That question clearly hurt her. Because deep down she already knew the answer. Because somebody's going to get hurt if this crazy shit keeps escalating. The sincerity in her voice told me she truly believed that. And honestly, so did I. Back at the ranch later that afternoon, Kyle nearly ripped the hard drive out of my hands the second I walked into the house. You got this from who? He asked excitedly. Sheila, the HOA treasurer. I replied as I sat down at the table. Kyle looked genuinely stunned. She flipped. Looks that way. Within 30 minutes, Kyle, Mackenzie, Wyatt, and Stephen were gathered around the dining room table reviewing files while Bandit wandered between everyone hoping somebody would accidentally drop food. The deeper Kyle dug into the files, the darker his expression became. Oh, this is bad. Really, really bad, he muttered. Mackenzie looked over from her laptop. How bad? Kyle stared at the screen. Federal bad. That quieted the room immediately. He started opening email chains one after another. Financial routing discussions. Vendor fraud. Board manipulation. Desert Pines communications. Then he stopped suddenly. What? I asked. Kyle slowly turned the laptop toward us. An email from Victoria. Subject line, make him leave. The body of the email made my stomach turn. I don't care how smart he thinks he is. Make his life miserable until he gives up and leaves the property voluntarily. Mackenzie looked horrified. Stephen's expression hardened instantly. Wyatt quietly folded his arms, shaking his head in disgust. Then Kyle opened another file. Payment transfers, cash withdrawals, unregistered contractor payouts, surveillance photos of my ranch. My blood ran cold. They were actually monitoring the property. Stephen leaned closer toward the screen. Not just monitoring. He pointed toward several timestamps. They were tracking schedules. The entire room went silent. Suddenly all those vehicles parked near the property. All those headlights slowing near the gates. All the strange activity. None of it had been random. It had all been organized. Bandit suddenly let out a low growl near the front window. Stephen immediately stood. What is it, boy? The dog kept staring toward the road. Stephen moved toward the blinds carefully and looked outside. His expression instantly darkened. Black SUV. My stomach tightened. BMW X5? Stephen nodded slowly. Parked near the road entrance again. Watching. Only this time, they weren't even trying to hide it anymore. About 48 hours later, everything exploded. Sheriff Charles Ryder arrived at the ranch just after sunrise alongside 2 county investigators. The look on his face told me immediately this wasn't a casual visit. You might want to sit down for this one, Ryder said. That's never a sentence anybody enjoys hearing. We gathered inside near the kitchen while Bandit paced restlessly nearby, sensing the tension in the room. Ryder placed several documents on the counter. We got warrants approved late last night. Kyle immediately looked up sharply. For who? Kyle asked sharply. Ryder's jaw tightened slightly. Silver Canyon Estates HOA offices. That alone made my pulse spike. But then he added, and Victoria Sterling's residence. Nobody spoke for a second. Then Kyle slowly smiled. Oh. She's done. Stick a fork in her 'cause she is so done. Ryder nodded once. Financial Crimes Division got involved after reviewing the hard drive. Mackenzie exhaled slowly. What about Desert Pines? She asked. Still under investigation. Stephen crossed his arms. And Victoria? Ryder looked directly at me. She's lawyered up already. Of course she has, no surprise there, right? I mumbled. The woman probably had attorneys on speed dial next to her Botox clinic. But despite the sarcasm running through my head, I could feel something shifting now. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, Victoria Sterling was no longer in control. And judging by what happened next, she knew it too. The raids hit Silver Canyon Estates like a bomb going off in the middle of a country club luncheon. That's the only way I can honestly describe it. By mid-morning, half of Silver Creek already knew something major was happening. Sheriff vehicles, county investigators, financial crimes units, and unmarked SUVs rolled into Silver Canyon Estates one after another, while stunned residents stood outside in expensive golf shirts and designer sunglasses watching officers carry boxes out of the HOA offices. Cal called me almost immediately. "Dude, you seeing this?" I stood near the patio watching local news helicopters circling faintly in the distance. "Hard not to," I replied. Bandit barked excitedly toward the sound of the helicopter blades overhead like he personally intended to defend Nevada airspace. Cal sounded almost impressed. "They moved fast." "How bad is it?" Mackenzie asked. "Bad enough they brought forensic accounting teams." That made me whistle softly under my breath. Financial crimes teams don't show up because somebody forgot to document landscaping expenses properly. They show up when they think serious fraud's involved. About an hour later, Ryder himself called me. "We're executing multiple warrants simultaneously," he explained. HOA offices, Victoria's residence, secondary vendor properties. "Any arrests?" I asked. "Not yet," Ryder replied. That yet hung heavily in the air. By early afternoon, local gossip had completely exploded across Genoa and Silver Creek. Silver Canyon residents were panicking. Board members suddenly couldn't be reached. Several HOA vendors had apparently vanished overnight. And according to Kyle, Desert Pines Land Investment LLC had abruptly stopped responding to multiple county inquiries entirely. Which usually means one thing: lawyers. Expensive ones. That evening, Steven stopped by the ranch while Josh Noland continued perimeter patrols near the north fencing. Bandit instantly ran toward Steven carrying a half-destroyed tennis ball in his mouth like some kind of proud little psychopath. "You spoil that dog too much," I muttered. Steven smirked slightly while throwing the ball across the yard. "Dogs got personality. Dogs got brain damage." I smirked, stifling a low laugh. Bandit flew after the ball anyway like his life depended on it. For a few minutes things actually felt strangely lighter. Maybe because for the first time since all this started, Victoria finally seemed to be on the defensive instead of me. Then Steven's phone rang. One glance at the screen immediately wiped the amusement off his face. He answered quietly. "Noland." Silence. Then, "Where?" Another pause. Steven's expression darkened instantly. "We're on our way." The second he hung up, I already knew something was wrong. "What happened?" I asked, running behind Steven. Josh spotted movement near the unfinished house. My stomach tightened immediately. "Workers." Steven shook his head once. "No scheduled crews tonight." Bandit immediately sensed the shift in tension and bounded back toward us, barking excitedly. Within minutes, we were heading across the property toward the unfinished house while Josh's flashlight beam moved near the structure in the distance. The partially completed home sat dark against the Nevada night, skeletal framing illuminated only by scattered security lights and moonlight reflecting faintly off the lake beyond it. As we got closer, I immediately saw Josh standing near the side entrance with his weapon drawn, and somebody else was on the ground. My pulse spiked instantly. What the hell happened? Josh looked up at us. Caught him trying to torch the place. The man on the ground groaned angrily while Josh kept him pinned beside the unfinished garage wall. Then I saw his face. It was none other than Nick Sterling. For several seconds, I honestly just stared at him. Victoria's adopted brother looked absolutely wrecked. Sweating heavily, eyes bloodshot, clothes filthy, and lying only a few feet away from him sat gasoline cans, road flares, lighter fluid, fire starters. Jesus Christ, Steven muttered as he slowly crouched near the supplies. "He wasn't bluffing either," I said in a growly low voice. Nick suddenly snapped toward me the second he heard my voice. "This is your fault, you stubborn, arrogant prick." I just stared at him in disbelief. "My fault, huh? You ruined everything," he bellowed. The guy looked half-crazed. Josh tightened his grip slightly. Easy there. Nick laughed bitterly. You think she's the problem? He spat. You have no idea what kind of pressure she's under right now. Pressure she put herself under, no doubt. I snapped back. That sentence hit harder than he probably intended. Because despite everything, part of me suddenly realized something. Victoria wasn't just desperate anymore. She was collapsing faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. Sheriff Ryder arrived roughly 20 minutes later alongside multiple deputies. The second rider saw the gasoline cans, his entire expression hardened. Well, he muttered darkly. That escalated quickly. Nick kept ranting almost nonstop while deputies hauled him upright. She promised this would fix everything. Ryder immediately looked at him sharply. She? Nick froze. Too little, too late. Ryder stepped closer slowly. You want to rethink how much you say without a lawyer present? Nick's breathing became uneven. For several seconds, he just stood there sweating beneath the patrol lights while the unfinished house loomed behind him. Then finally, he broke. She said if Nathan left, he muttered shakily, the Desert Pines deal would go through. Nobody spoke. Even the deputies seemed frozen for a second. Nick laughed bitterly again. She said they'd pay enough to fix everything. Ryder's eyes narrowed. What exactly needed fixing, Nick? That question seemed to completely deflate him. My company's gone, he muttered quietly. Insurance investigators, lawsuits, debt. His voice cracked slightly. She said this was the only way out. For God's sake, I muttered angrily. The entire thing suddenly felt even uglier somehow. Not because Nick was innocent. He absolutely wasn't. But because Victoria had clearly dragged everybody around her into the collapse with her. Ryder eventually motioned deputies forward. Take him in. Nick looked toward me one final time before they shoved him toward the patrol vehicle. And honestly, what I saw in his face wasn't hatred anymore. It was fear. Pure fear. The second the patrol cars finally disappeared down the road, silence settled heavily across the property again. The unfinished house stood dark beneath the desert sky while cool wind rolled softly across the sand around us. Bandit wandered over and pressed himself quietly against my leg. Steven stared out toward the distant lights of Silver Canyon Estates. She's gonna panic now, he said quietly. I looked toward the HOA lights glowing faintly half a mile away, and deep down, I knew he was right, because Victoria Sterling had officially run out of moves. And desperate people do reckless, stupid-ass shit when the walls finally start closing in. By the following morning, the entire situation had detonated publicly. News vans lined portions of the road leading toward Silver Canyon Estates. Reporters stood outside the subdivision entrance talking dramatically into cameras, while residents lingered nearby pretending they weren't openly eavesdropping on every rumor spreading through the neighborhood. Silver Creek had officially become entertainment. And at the center of it all, Victoria Sterling, the now official village idiot. Bandit barked furiously at one of the helicopters circling overhead while I stood near the patio drinking coffee that had long since gone cold. Honestly, exhaustion had finally started catching up with me. Not physical exhaustion, mental exhaustion, the kind that settles deep in your bones after weeks of nonstop stress. Kyle arrived just after 8 carrying another stack of paperwork thick enough to choke a T-Rex. You know, I muttered as he climbed out of his truck. Normal people bring donuts when visiting somebody. You're getting federal investigations instead. Try appreciating the effort. Kyle chuckled. Bandit sprinted toward him at full speed. Kyle sighed dramatically. Oh goody, the furry velociraptor's awake. Good times. Bandit immediately shoved a slobber-covered tennis ball into his hand. Wonderful, Kyle muttered. Disease. Despite everything, I laughed. That was one thing I'd noticed throughout this entire nightmare. No matter how ugly things became, moments of normal life still somehow forced their way through the cracks. Maybe that's how people survive chaos. Little pieces of ordinary life refusing to disappear completely. A few minutes later, Mackenzie arrived carrying breakfast sandwiches and enough coffee to medically revive a small village. Bless you, Kyle muttered immediately. I know, she smiled. Bandit instantly abandoned Kyle and ran toward her instead. Unbelievable, Kyle shouted after him. I fed you beef jerky last week. Clearly he's evolved beyond you, Mackenzie replied while scratching behind Bandit's ears. For a few brief minutes things almost felt normal again. Then Sheriff Ryder's SUV rolled onto the property. And the second he stepped out, every trace of humor vanished. Sheriff Ryder looked exhausted. Not physically, professionally, like a man watching a situation become far larger than he originally expected. That bad? I asked quietly. Ryder exhaled heavily. You got any idea how many calls my office got overnight? Guessing a lot, I replied. Half the damn county wants to know if their HOA president's running a criminal organization, Ryder said in a gruff, tired voice. Kyle looked up from his paperwork. Well, Ryder shot him a look. Not helping, he grumbled. We all moved inside near the kitchen table while Bandit settled beside Mackenzie's chair watching everyone carefully. Ryder removed several folders from his case. Nick Sterling talked. That immediately quieted the room. Kyle leaned forward first. How much? Ryder gave a tired laugh. Enough that financial crimes investigators practically started salivating. Like rats at the pig trough. He opened the folder. Nick confirmed Victoria authorized harassment tactics against Nathan's property. Mackenzie's jaw tightened slightly. Directly, Ryder nodded. He also confirmed Desert Pines Land Investment LLC promised substantial compensation if Nathan's property became available for acquisition. I folded my arms slowly, still listening. So she really was trying to force me out. Oh, she absolutely was, without any doubt, Ryder said bluntly. Kyle looked toward the paperwork. What about the fake vendors? Ryder slid several photographs across the table. Empty office spaces, vacant lots, closed buildings. Most of the companies receiving HOA money barely existed. Money laundering? Mackenzie asked. Possibly, the sheriff replied. Kyle gave a low whistle. Jesus Murphy. Not the sharpest tools in the shed hay. But then Ryder's expression darkened even further. There's something else. That sentence was quickly becoming everybody's least favorite phrase. Ryder looked directly at me. We believe Victoria's preparing to flee. The entire room froze. What? I said sharply. She withdrew large amounts of cash yesterday afternoon after the warrants hit. Kyle immediately stood. How much? Enough, Ryder replied sharply. Stephen Finley entered through the back patio door at almost the exact same moment. And judging by his face, he already knew. Vehicle movement at Silver Canyon, he said immediately. Multiple packed SUVs. Looks like they're clearing things out. Kyle swore under his breath. Ryder immediately grabbed his phone. If she runs now, it'll make her look guilty as hell. She is guilty as hell, Kyle snapped. Bandit suddenly stood barking toward the front windows again. Josh Nolan's security truck tore onto the property seconds later. Josh jumped out before the vehicle had even fully stopped. Sheriff, he called. Ryder stepped outside immediately. What? Josh pointed back toward the road. Black BMW X5 just left Silver Canyon heading north fast. Nevada license plates registered to a Victoria Sterling. Every muscle in my body tightened instantly. Course good old Victoria. Ryder was already moving. Let's go. Within seconds patrol vehicles, Paladin security trucks, and Ryder's SUV were flying down the road out of Silver Creek. We all stood near the porch watching dust trails disappear into the distance while Bandit paced anxiously beside me. Mackenzie stepped quietly beside me. She calmly reached out and held my hand. You okay? Honestly, I didn't even know anymore. Part of me wanted Victoria caught immediately. Another part still couldn't fully process the fact that the woman at the center of all this madness was my sister. Fraternal twin. Same blood. Completely different lives. About 40 minutes later, Ryder finally called. And from the tone of his voice, I already knew. She didn't make it far. Ryder stated. I closed my eyes briefly. Where? I asked. Checkpoint outside Carson Valley, Ryder said. Apparently, Victoria Sterling finally realized something during that drive north. The walls weren't closing in anymore. They'd already closed. By evening, every local news station in the region was covering the story. Silver Canyon Estates HOA officially suspended operations pending criminal investigation. Multiple financial audits launched. Desert Pines under active investigation. Victoria Sterling detained pending charges connected to fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement, intimidation, attempted coercion, and potential involvement in the attempted arson of my home. But strangely enough, none of that brought me satisfaction. Not real satisfaction anyway, because sitting out by the lake later that night, listening to desert wind move softly through the brush while Bandit rested beside me in the sand, all I could think about was how unbelievably tragic the whole thing really was. Somewhere out there was a version of my life where Victoria and I might have grown up together. Fishing trips, horseback rides, family dinners. Maybe she would have sat beside me right there at the lake while Grandpa taught us both how to cast lines into the water at sunrise. Instead, greed had destroyed her. Fear destroyed her. And now everything she built was collapsing around her piece by piece. Bandit rested his head quietly against my leg. I stared out across the dark water for a long moment before quietly muttering, "You really screwed this up for yourself, sis." The desert wind carried the words away into the darkness. And somehow, that felt like the saddest part of all. The courtroom was already packed before proceedings even started. Reporters lining the back of the courtroom, county officials, Silver Canyon residents, former HOA board members suddenly pretending they'd never agreed with Victoria about anything. Funny how quickly loyalty disappears once federal investigators start carrying boxes out of offices. Bandit had stayed back at the ranch with Stephen and Josh that morning, which honestly was probably for the best. The dog would have either barked at reporters, stolen somebody's lunch, or somehow become the star witness. Possibly all three, if you ask me. Mackenzie sat beside me reviewing notes one final time, while Miguel Reyes stood near the prosecution table quietly organizing files with the same calm expression he always wore. That man never looked nervous. Ever. Honestly, it was unsettling. Kyle leaned over quietly. "You know," he muttered. "Victoria's attorney looks like he regrets every decision that brought him here." I glanced toward the defense table. He wasn't wrong. Victoria herself looked completely different than the woman who'd first stepped out of that black BMW X5 at my property months earlier. Gone was the polished confidence. Gone was the superiority. Gone was the carefully controlled image. Now she just looked exhausted, scared, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, human. The strange part? That somehow made everything sadder. Judge Carl Hansen entered a few moments later, immediately bringing the entire courtroom to order. The proceedings lasted nearly 4 days. And honestly, watching Miguel dismantle Victoria's operation piece by piece was almost terrifying. The man didn't argue emotionally. He dissected people. Calmly, precisely, relentlessly. By the end of day 1, financial fraud had been established, fake vendors exposed, and shell company transfers connected directly to Silver Canyon Estates accounts. By day 2, Desert Pines Land Investment LLC had officially distanced itself from Victoria entirely, which translated roughly into corporate language as, "We'd like to pretend we've never met this woman." Nick Sterling's testimony hit hardest emotionally, because by then the man looked completely broken. Not dangerous anymore, just broken. He admitted Victoria had pressured him repeatedly, promised Desert Pines money would solve everything, and convinced him Nathan's property was the only golden ticket out. When Miguel asked him directly if Victoria ordered intimidation tactics against me, Nick lowered his head and quietly answered, "Yes." The courtroom went dead silent. Then came Sheila Nichols. Honestly, I almost felt bad for her. Almost. The woman looked like she'd aged 10 years in a month, and she was only 42. But unlike Victoria, Sheila actually accepted responsibility for what she'd enabled. She admitted false accounting, fake assessments, fraudulent project authorizations, and years of manipulated HOA finances. Then Miguel brought up the infamous pool fund. "Mrs. Nichols," he said calmly, How much money was allocated toward the proposed Silver Canyon community pool expansion? She swallowed nervously. Approximately $410,000. Miguel nodded once. And how much of the pool was ultimately built? Sheila looked down at her trembling hands. None of it. A few people in the courtroom actually laughed quietly before Judge Hanson shut them down immediately. Then finally, Victoria took the stand. And honestly, that was the moment the entire story emotionally changed for me. Because for the first time since this whole thing began, I wasn't looking at some delusional, untouchable HOA tyrant anymore. I was looking at my sister, my fraternal twin, a woman whose life had spiraled so far into greed, fear, and desperation that she destroyed herself trying to control everyone around her. Miguel approached carefully. Mrs. Sterling, he began calmly, did you authorize surveillance and intimidation efforts against Nathan Bingham's property? Victoria's attorney objected immediately. Judge Hanson overruled him. Victoria looked exhausted, cornered, and for several seconds she didn't answer. Then finally, she muttered yes. The courtroom stirred instantly. Miguel continued. Why? And there it was. The question underneath the entire story. Why? Why destroy lives? Why obsess over land? Why manipulate people? Why escalate everything so far? Victoria slowly looked toward me for the first time in days. And honestly, what I saw in her expression wasn't hatred anymore. It was regret. I was trying to hold everything together, she said quietly. Miguel didn't react. The HOA? No, my life, she replied softly. Silence filled the courtroom. Then Victoria finally said the thing I think everybody already knew deep down. I was drowning, and honestly, for the first time, I believed her. Not because it excused anything. Didn't. Not even close. But somewhere along the line Victoria stopped seeing people as people. She started seeing them as threats to survival. And once somebody reaches that point, they'll justify almost anything. The sentencing phase came 2 days later. Judge Carl Hansen didn't sugarcoat anything. He openly condemned the corruption, intimidation, financial fraud, abuse of authority, and deliberate harassment campaign carried out through Silver Canyon Estates HOA. Then came the final rulings. Silver Canyon Estates HOA permanently dissolved. All HOA assets frozen pending financial recovery proceedings. Nathan Bingham awarded $2.1 million in damages. Nick Sterling, 7 years in state prison for attempted arson, no chance for parole. Then finally, Victoria Sterling, 10 years in state women's prison, parole after 7 years, 5 years probation following release. The courtroom fell completely silent after Judge Hanson finished speaking. Victoria lowered her head slowly while deputies approached beside her. And for one brief second before they led her away, she looked toward me again. Not angry, not hateful, just tired. Like somebody finally realizing the war they fought destroyed everything they were trying to protect. A few weeks later, Silver Canyon Estates looked almost abandoned. Half the HOA board resigned. Several homes quietly went up for sale, including Victoria's 2-story Victorian house. Desert pines disappeared completely from the area after investigators started circling their operations. And slowly, life around Silver Creek finally became peaceful again. The reporters eventually left. The helicopters disappeared. The strange vehicles stopped watching the property at night. The silence returned. Real silence. A few days after things finally settled down, I went to see Victoria. The correctional facility sat nearly 2 hours outside Carson City, surrounded by flat desert and old fencing that looked like it had survived 3 different decades without maintenance. The entire drive out there felt strange. For months, Victoria Sterling had been the center of every disaster surrounding Silver Creek. Every threat, every escalation, every sleepless night. And now I was voluntarily walking back into her orbit one final time. The visitation area was quieter than I expected. No yelling, no chaos, just fluorescent lights, concrete walls, and the kind of silence that made every sound feel too loud. When they finally brought her in, she looked different. Not weak, Not broken, just exhausted, like life had finally caught up to her all at once. She stopped cold when she saw me sitting there. "Nathan," I motioned toward the chair across from me. "We need to talk." Her expression immediately hardened with caution, but she sat anyway. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I finally exhaled slowly. "There's something you need to know." She frowned slightly. "What?" I held her gaze. "We're twins." The words landed like a physical impact. For a moment she just stared at me in complete disbelief, like her brain genuinely couldn't process what it had just heard. "What?" "We have the same biological parents," I said quietly. "Different lives, different adopted families, but the same blood." Victoria blinked several times, almost disoriented. "No," she whispered automatically. "No, that's not possible." "It is," I said evenly. The room fell silent again. I could practically see the memories and timelines rearranging themselves behind her eyes while she tried to make sense of everything. Finally, she leaned back slightly, staring at the table. "My God," she whispered. I let her sit with it for a minute before continuing. "When you get out of here, you won't be alone." That finally made her look back up. "My grandfather's farmhouse still sits on the north end of the property," I explained. "Once my own place is completely finished, I'm renovating the farmhouse too. Full rebuild. New plumbing, electrical, roofing, all of it." She stared at me cautiously, clearly waiting for the catch. "You can live there if you want to," I said simply. Her expression faltered again. "I'm also setting aside $750,000 for you," I continued. "Enough to start over properly somewhere if you want to." That finally shattered whatever emotional wall she still had left. Her face crumpled almost instantly. You can't be serious," she whispered. "Ah, but I am dead serious." "Why?" she suddenly choked out. "After everything I did to you? Nate, I made your life a living hell." I stayed quiet for a moment before answering. "Because I just found out that we're family," I said softly. "And family, most of the time, sticks together." Victoria looked away sharply as tears finally spilled down her face. Not fake tears, not crocodile tears, but real ones. "I don't deserve that," she whispered brokenly. "Maybe not," I admitted gently, "but the offer's still there." For several long moments she just sat there crying quietly while trying unsuccessfully to pull herself back together. Finally she looked up again. Do you really think somebody like me can change?" I thought about that carefully before answering. "I think people can stop becoming the worst versions of themselves and become the best versions of themselves too," I said. "But they have to want it badly enough. It basically boils down to choices and how those choices can affect your life." That answer seemed to hit her harder than anything else. When the visitation period finally ended, I slowly stood from the table. For a second, I thought she might say something else. Instead, she suddenly stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me. The hug felt awkward, uncertain. Neither of us really knew how to process what had just happened. But somehow, it still felt real. When she finally pulled back, she wiped at her face before letting out a small, shaky laugh. "So," she said quietly, "you're my brother, huh?" I smiled faintly. "Kind of looks that way." Victoria studied my face for another second before shaking her head slightly. "Twins, you say?" she muttered. "Well, I sure as hell don't look anything like you." That caught me off guard enough to laugh. A real laugh. Victoria laughed too, softly wiping at her eyes again. And for the first time since this entire nightmare started, she didn't look like my enemy anymore. Just someone lost who finally had a chance to become something else. Something better. Back at the ranch, life slowly started taking on a different shape. Not perfect. Not magically repaired overnight. Just steadier. A month after the trial finally ended, Mackenzie and I quietly tied the knot in a small ceremony out near the north pasture beneath the cottonwoods overlooking Silver Creek. Nothing extravagant. No massive guest list. Just the people who had stayed standing beside us when everything else fell apart. Bandit took his responsibilities as ring-bearer far more seriously than anyone expected. Kyle nearly lost composure laughing when Bandit refused to hand over the rings until bribed with part of Wyatt's steak slider from the reception table. Miguel claimed the dog had inherited my stubbornness. Wyatt argued Bandit was actually the smartest member of the entire group. Honestly, both were probably right. Kyle stood beside me as best man, while Miguel and Wyatt helped organize the ceremony setup alongside half the ranch staff who had basically become family long before any of us admitted it out loud. And when Mackenzie walked toward me through the evening sunlight wearing that soft smile that somehow still calmed every storm in my head, I think that was the moment I truly realized we'd survived it. Not just the lawsuits, not just Victoria, all of it. The fear, the pressure, the constant feeling that life was one bad day away from collapsing. Somehow, we'd made it through. One evening near the end of summer, I rode out toward the lake alone while Bandit sprinted ahead through the sand, chasing absolutely nothing important. The sunset spread gold and deep orange across the water, while cool desert wind rolled softly through the brush around the shoreline. For the first time in months, everything felt calm again. Bandit eventually trotted back over and dropped beside me near the water with a tired sigh before resting his head across my boot. I stared out across the lake quietly for a long time. Then my grandfather's voice drifted through my memory again. Most people spend their whole lives looking for peace, Nathan. I smiled softly to myself, because now I finally understood what he meant. Peace isn't something you buy. It isn't power. It isn't control. And it sure as hell isn't something forced through fear. Peace is sitting beside a quiet Nevada lake at sunset with the people and animals who stayed beside you when life got ugly. Everything else? That's just noise. Bandit suddenly lifted his head and barked excitedly toward the shoreline before taking off chasing another terrified dragonfly through the sand like it had personally insulted his ancestors. I laughed softly under my breath while watching him disappear down the beach. Then I leaned back against the old shoreline rock beside me, listening to the desert wind move peacefully across the water while the last sunlight faded slowly behind the mountains surrounding Silver Creek. And for the first time in a very long while, home finally felt like home again.